Hey folks, it's Marvin Cash, the host of The Articulate Fly. On this episode, I'm joined by Jake Villwock, owner of Relentless Fly Fishing. Jake shares his fly fishing journey, and we take a deep dive into all things smallmouth. I think you're really going to enjoy this one. But before we get to the interview, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you like the podcast, please tell a friend, and please subscribe and leave us a rating and review in the podcatcher of your choice. It really helps us out. And a shout out to this episode's sponsor. This episode's sponsored by our friends at Norvise. Their motto is, tie better flies faster, and they produce the only vise that truly spins. If you tie articulated patterns, you owe it to yourself to check out their new shank jaws. The first production run sold out in minutes, but Tim and Tyler have reloaded. To check out the new jaws and Norvise's other great products, head over to www.nor-vice.com. Now, on to our interview. Well, Jake, welcome to the Articulate Fly.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our conversation this evening, and we have a tradition on the show. We always ask our guests to share their earliest fishing memory.
I would say, I kind of thought about this when I saw the questions. I would say my earliest fishing memory was actually, I was 5, and I was doing a bass tournament with my dad. And I was fishing, one of those little like jitterbugs or some sort of topwater bug. And I threw it towards these lily pads, and all of a sudden this wake came out from around the bush, and I looked at Dad real quick in my 5-year-old, voice, and I was like, "Oh, Dad, there's one." And out pops this mallard hen, and she tried to eat my jitterbug. And I remember getting so excited because I had no idea what was happening. And my dad said, "No, you can't let that thing eat that." And I was like, but, and so besides the duck, I would say my earliest fishing memory was actually, doing a bass tournament with my dad when I was 5. So, it kind of suits the fact that now my main target is smallmouth. So.
Yeah. And, it's interesting too. I always ask folks, when they came to the dark side of fly fishing.
I was actually probably more of a late bloomer. I picked up a fly rod when I was probably a senior in high school. And it was actually my dad. He had a 9-foot 6-weight, fiberglass South Bend rod, and, with a Pfluger medalist, still had the same fly line on it that when he bought it, 30 years prior. And I just went to a bass pond and thought I was going to catch a bluegill and or something, and did not. So, I messed around with that for a little bit, and kind of went back and forth between the fly and spinning rod for most of my college career, and then post college is kind of when I dove head first into the fly fishing side of it and the industry, and kind of jumped head first all in once. I went from being a hobby here and there fly fisherman to full-fledged guide, and that was a pretty awesome experience. But yeah, so that was my first experience and I every once in a while I go home to my parents' house and I decide I don't want to take a fly rod because I just want to visit my family, and it's inevitable when my dad's like, let's go bass fishing, let's go striper fishing, and I'm like, okay, so let me have that fiberglass rod again, and it's still 40 years later still has the same exact fly line on it. And I love the technology of fly lines today, but somehow a 40-year-old fly line still casts that rod just fine.
Yeah, very, very neat. And obviously, right, you graduated from college, you guided in Alaska, you came back to the East Coast. You've probably, spent a lot of time around a lot of fishy people. Who are some of the folks that have mentored you on your fly fishing journey?
I would, besides my dad kind of handing me the rod and saying, this is how I taught myself, I'd give him a lot of credit just for, not just fishing, or not just fly fishing, but, fishing in general. He's kind of instilled that in me most of my life. But my first boss in the industry, Paul Fitzgibbon, ran he still does, runs a single party lodge in Sitka, Alaska. So he splits it. He does deep sea stuff and fly fishing. And Paul, when I started guiding 14 years ago, he said he had been guiding for 25 years at that point, and there could be a lot of guys out there at that point in their life, in their career, they're just like kind of burn out and, not super energetic. And, but Paul was, he was 25 years in and just, he was contagious when it came to the love of the sport and just, loved being a guide in general. And, and so for me, it was, I started off, doing the deep sea stuff as well as fly fishing. So I was a deckhand and a fly fishing guide. And, I could have went either direction. But I just kind of fell to the fly fishing side and, didn't love the client base that we would get with, the deep sea stuff. It was, how big can we catch? How many can we kill? And, there's whales breaching and orcas that are so close to the boat that you can see the water dripping down their dorsal fin. And they're just like, I want another salmon. And then you get the guys that came up fly fishing and, they're watching the eagles and the bears. You're, hiking up these, 4 or 5 mile rivers and there's nobody around and they're just full of salmon and trout and char. And you just, that beauty is what really, really, sucked me in pretty hard. And Paul was, to this day, every once in a while I get to go back up there and he calls it a celebrity guide appearance. He'll book a big group and, he could find a local guide, but he just likes to get me up there and so he'll say, hey, do you want to come, guide for 10 days? And I'm like, yeah, and so, pushing 40 years in the industry, he's still, up until, 2:00 in the morning and up at 4:30 and just, doesn't even skip a beat. So, I would say, Paul was definitely a huge influence. And then one of the guys that I guided with up there, Tom Larson, he, was kind of part-time guide for Paul and just, super fishy guy, loved to walk up the rivers and, start time flies. Actually, he got into it way later than I did. We started time flies, about the same time. So those two guys were definitely like, when it came to the guide side, they were my kind of, motivation to stick with it. And, moving to Pennsylvania, starting work for TCO, Tony's the owner of TCO. He's kind of definitely a mentor and I would consider him almost a fatherly figure. Anytime I have a question, the other day I had a question for him. I texted him and I said, I need some professional and some fatherly advice. And, he's always one to give some good intel. And, he's always believed in me from, the day I walked in the store, 13 years ago, till now. So, he's helped me grow this business and saw something in my drive before I did, so, those are kind of the three guys I would say, besides my dad, obviously being number one, in that influence. So, yeah.
Yeah, very, very neat. And you mentioned briefly, getting into fly tying and you said you were kind of a late fly fishing bloomer. What drew you to fly tying?
I would say, the first year I was in Alaska, so I kind of went again, kind of head first into the tying. I was talking to some of the clients and one guy was telling me about, his grandfather's estate that they just cleaned out and he had like 12, vices that he was sitting on. And I, kind of nonchalantly said, hey, if you ever want to get rid of one, let me know. I'll buy one. And he said, I'll send you one. And so a week later when he left, I got a package in the mail and it was a Thompson A vice, C clamp and no rotary or any of that stuff. And I remember we were steelhead fishing and we used to use these starlight leeches and they were only tied on a size 2. And some of the smaller trout would come out and try to eat them, but they were too big. And I said, man, I gotta tie these smaller. So I went to the fly shop. There was one fly shop in Sitka and there was a craft store / fly tying area. You walked in and it was, issues of fly tying magazine from 20 years ago covered in dust and, all this, hot glue sticks and stuff. And you had a little bin of fly tying material. And so between those two places, I pieced together the materials that I needed for the starlight leech and tied it in a size, I think 6 or 8. And then, honestly teaching myself how to tie flies, I tied it backwards. I started from the eye and tied back. So the first fly I ever tied, I whip finished at the tail. And I said, this is really hard. Why is that so difficult? And then I started looking at one of the magazines I bought from, I don't know, it was probably like 88 or 89. And I was like, oh, you start from the back and you go forward. And from then on, it kind of made more sense to me.
Very neat. And, it's interesting because I talk to a lot of people that I bring on the show about fly fishing, and a lot of them that tie, they also fish gear, and it really has a significant impact on their tying and their fly design. I know you fish gear too. Is that the same for you?
Absolutely. I've got, a lot of diehard fly guys that, sometimes will have the spinner rods in the boat because I just have them in there for the day before, and they're easier to transport in the boat. And it's like, what are you doing with those things? And, then I have to go through the 10-minute spiel on, how, fishing spinning rods is pretty awesome because you get to see not only from the fly design standpoint, but also from like a hook set standpoint and a presentation standpoint. If you're fishing a tube jig or, a Ned rig or some sort of soft plastic on the bottom, I mean, the guys that just slowly bounce that thing on the bottom don't really do anything. Just let that thing drag and they feel a little weight, they reel down, and it's a very, very subtle hook set. They're 5-6 to 1 to the guy that's, Bill Danton reeling down and largemouth setting on those, those things. And, when you have it's just like a rising trout. If you have a trout that's going to rise really slow to your dry fly, you don't rip that fly as soon as it eats it, you let it eat it. And so, when I fish crayfish and stuff like that, I tell my guys, I'm like, look, like if you feel something, just pull a little bit harder. And if it starts to pull away or you feel something more than just a rock, like then give it a little bit of a love tap and then go to town on it. And so, not only from a fly design, which I'll circle back on that, but just a presentation and even just a hook set, you can learn a lot from the ways that you spin fish to the ways that you present a fly and things like that. And fly design, I've talked to Mike Schultz and Blaine Chocolate and all those guys, and, I would consider them all, pretty good friends. And, they're kind of next level. But, we always talk about, how do you create a fly to do what, a specific lure will do or what a soft plastic will do. And, one of my signature flies that I'm, super proud of, the Roamer. I was fishing stripers with my dad, and he was fishing like rubber flukes or swim baits, and he was just crushing stripers on them. And I couldn't catch one to save my life on any of my flies that, that I'd tried or that were tried and true. And so I went home that night and I tied this fly that kind of resembled the look of a fluke, and didn't really at that point have any idea how to make it move like a fluke. But, over a few years of tweaking and this or that, I got it to, slide side to side and, give it that kind of fluky look. And so, just from that experience with my dad, and watching him fish that fluke and get these bass to eat it, and me not be able to do that with anything that I had because it wouldn't move that way. And the next day I went out and I caught, 2, 30-inch stripers, which was for the Chesapeake at the time of year. That was pretty spectacular. But yeah, I mean, a lot of my crayfish patterns, a lot of my hellgrammite patterns that I tie, I look at, the splash that a lead head creates when it hits the water in comparison to and how a fish reacts to that in low clear water. And, I've been messing with different, weight of lead, even going down to, bead chain eyes sometimes when the water's super low and clear. Cause you get a fly that just drops the bottom really fast with heavy lead, and it's going to get stuck almost immediately because it wants to fall right into its first crevice. It wants to get as deep as it possibly can. Where if you, start looking at these guys and how they fish, lighter tubes and, sometimes weightless worms, and you get those fish to eat them on the drop, I want to figure out how do I create a fly to do that? How do I get it to fish not only on the bottom without getting stuck, but also how do I fish it on the drop and stay connected? And what's the, the fine line between too light and too heavy, and, kind of switching around and messing with that stuff. And so, yeah, not only are you trying to necessarily imitate what a specific lure does, and sometimes you don't need to, because I think sometimes flies, the way they're softer and the way they glide more than jerk around, I think sometimes, depending on the conditions, that softer, subtler presentation is what fly fishing has an advantage over spin fishing in a lot of ways. And so, there's a huge full circle when it comes to, fishing gear and designing and fishing flies. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I would imagine that there are other things that you're thinking about. Because, like, I know you guide a lot, right? So the last thing you want to do is to come off the water and need to tie a fly that takes an hour to tie, right? So, in addition to kind of the way that to maybe mimic the way gear fishes and looking at those triggers and presentation, what are some of those other things that kind of, for example, different materials, finding an easier way to get to where you need to be, things like that?
I mean, I think profile is a huge thing. And so I love sitting at the vise and, spending 45 minutes tying a crayfish and then swear sometimes, out loud, but a lot of times in my head when, 10 minutes into fishing it gets stuck on the bottom and we can't get it out. So, but I also feel like, I take a lot of pride in my fly box, and I'm pretty OCD when it comes to fly boxes. And so I want it to look pretty, and I want to fish well. And, I want to be happy about the fly that I tie. So, a lot of times I would rather spend 40 minutes tying, one fly or two flies, and it come out exactly what I wanted to and do exactly what I want, versus how do I cut corners? How do I make it simpler, but yet still effective? And so, it is a fine line between that, wanting to get home and, spend some time with, my significant other and make sure she's doing all right and happy and, be a good partner. And then all right, I'm going to the time room. I got to tie for 3 hours, so, I would say just profile is the biggest thing. If you can create something that doesn't take a long time, but still gives you that profile and that action you want, you can, that is a happy median. But, I have to fish a fly that I'm confident in. And if I'm not confident in it, I'm not going to fish it. But, I have a fly that's very similar, to Schultz's, red-eyed leech and, a couple of his other bottom mouthy ones that are, a lot of rabbit and a couple of rubber legs. And, you add a little bit of foam sometimes to glue it on the back of the tail to help that tail stand up a little bit more. And, they take 5-10 minutes to tie. So you can crank it, 6 or 10 of them out in an hour. And they fish just as well. But, when I'm in my artistic mode, I'm going to sit here and tie a, double or triple articulated or even a game changer, style crayfish, and just kind of have to deal with it if I lose it. So.
Yeah, there you go. Like I said, hopefully not in the first 10 minutes of the trip, right?
Yeah, I mean, so you lose them. I've got a couple crayfish that, that do take me about 30 minutes to tie. And, I fished one for, 4 days before we lost it. And I said, you know what? That fly has served its purpose. It's got, probably 100 fish on it and, a couple giant catfish. And, it served its purpose. It caught its fish. So it's okay if I donate that one to the river. But, I hate it when, you're 10 minutes in and the guy's like, oh, shoot, I lost another one. I mean, I remember 2 years ago we were fishing. I got into tying the crafty changers and got super, super OCD about the taper. And so it'd take me an hour and a half to tie. And then, I got into those mallard changers with the, kind of veiled mallard. And they, they'll take me 2.5 hours if I really, really wanted to get it perfect. And, I've got guys that'll throw it 20 feet in a tree. How? I have no idea, but they do. And then they just rip it off and they're like, oh, sorry. And I'll nonchalantly say oh, well, there goes 2 hours of my life. And they'll turn around and they'll be like, what? And I'm like, well, I didn't buy that, and they're like, oh shoot, I'm so sorry, So sometimes I'll give a client a hard time, but most of the time you just kind of got to eat it and know that that's what's possibly going to happen if you spend that much time tying a fly. So, but, I'm all about, any fly that I would fish, I would also let my clients fish. So I'm not one of those guys that's like, here's the guide box and here's my box. It's like, if it's good enough for me and if it's good enough for them. So, I try not to skimp on that.
Got it. And you mentioned Blaine and Schultze, who are some of the other folks that have influenced you as a tyer?
I mean, those two for sure. And, Lefty Cray, we kind of have a similar, he was a Maryland boy. I was a Maryland boy. And, I've always loved his deceiver and it's been one of my favorite flies. And so, getting to meet him a few times was pretty awesome. And just looking at, reading some of his books and stuff. And then, Dave Skoke, big saltwater tire and fisherman in the Northeast. Like his mush mouth fly is one of my favorite striper flies, and still to this day one of the hardest ones to get right. You look at it and you're like, that's super simple, but when it comes down to it, it's a pretty difficult one to actually tie. So of course, growing up on the Chesapeake and originally being kind of a saltwater guy, a lot of my influence are guys that spend a lot of their time on the saltwater because, as much as I love smallmouth, the salt is definitely my true passion. So, but I shouldn't say it's my true passion. It's where I cut my teeth, and I love all predator fish personally. But so I would say those four guys are huge, and even Greg Senyo. I remember when I was still managing the shop, we did a couple celebrity tying appearances, and I got Senyo and Schultz and Blaine, and it was kind of cool. I lived above the fly shop, and so when I was setting up, I said, hey, if you guys don't want to pay for a hotel, you guys, I've got a couch. You guys are more than happy to crash on it. And so, all those guys stayed with me and drank some beer afterwards, tied some flies. And I remember I was thinking about submitting some flies, to Orvis at the time. And I showed Senyo my roamer, and he said, send that right away. I've never seen, he's like, obviously it's a saltwater fly. It's got some deceiver influence, but he's like, I've never seen, a fly tied, that specific way. And I just showed him a couple other flies, and he was very helpful. He was like, this fly is awesome, but it doesn't have any sex appeal. So you gotta add it. Will fish eat it? Absolutely. Will people buy it? Probably not. It looks too simple. So go back and, make it a little bit flashier. And I took everything he said, and sure enough, like I submitted those flies, and Orvis loved them. And so, I have got to give him a lot of credit for helping me with that and being very, very, as if you've ever met Senyo or heard him talk, he's very blunt, and he'll tell you how he feels. And I think that was awesome because, he gave me some very, very good feedback and ideas. And so, those guys have always kind of, and I mean, one of the first blogs I ever looked at was, Steelhead Alley Outfitters, Senyo's tying blog. So a lot of my original East Coast steelhead flies came from tying those flies on his site. So got to give him credit too. And I'm sure there's a bunch of other people, but I could sit here for an hour and probably tell you everybody that's helped me out. So.
Yeah, very, very neat. And I always like to ask, guys that tie a lot to share the most unusual tool that they use that they can't live without.
That's a good question. I would probably say I have two tools that I don't leave home without, or that are always on my bench. And one of them is so I tie a lot with the right bobbins that have the adjustment to it. And I was trying to figure out a way to make a handheld, kind of wrench for that thing. And my buddy Rob came up to me one day. He's like, dude, I found it. And I was like, what? He goes, it's a Lego. And it's this little 4-pronged Lego that we mounted to a hair packer. We glued it in there, and so now it's like a little wrench that, loosens and tightens the drag on a right bobbin. And so that one, I have two of them, and I might be the only person in the world that has them. But that's one of those weird tools that I never leave without. And then because I tie with so much bucktail, I used to never leave home without a big pen, the tube on a big pen to push the deer back. But there's a new tool out that came out a couple years ago called the Proto John, and it's a 3D tube in 3 or 4 different sizes, and they make a really small one that's not much, a little smaller than a big pen, but it's got kind of grooves on it, so it holds that bucktail when you push it back. And I have one of the original ones when the guy was designing them. He had a big one and kind of what he would call the full size one. And I said, can you make one that's a little smaller for flies like this? He was at a show with me, and he was like, yeah. So a week later, he sent me one, and I have that thing. It's bright orange, so I can't lose it. So yeah, those are two pretty unique tools. A common tool that I never leave without, or I've always got, is a pair of hemostats. Because when you're tying with rooster hackles or rooster feathers and stuff like that, and you're trying to put them on the side of a shank, if you tie them in with a non-smashed spine. Sometimes they spin a little bit. And so I always have a pair of hemostats with me so I can smush the spines of the feathers. So they typically lay a lot easier on the sides of the fly.
Yeah, very neat. You know, that tying tool you were talking about, when I was reading your book this weekend, getting ready for the interview, and when I saw that mentioned in the tools that you liked, I think it was there's a video on the Mad River site, and I was pretty blown away. It's a pretty slick tool.
Yeah, I mean it's super cool, and not to name drop, but I remember we were at the Lefties Tie Fest in Maryland, small show, and Bob Popovics was there, and I was there. Actually, I got smushed at the tying table between Bob Popovics and Rich Strolla, so it was kind of cool. I had kind of two streamer legends, I was smushed in between them, and we were kind of talking about it, and Bob came up with the idea of actually making it kind of variegated on the inside so that the bucktail wouldn't spin. It would hold it in place as you push it back. And so it was kind of cool to have that experience. And I guess Popovics would also be another influential, tire when it came to, kind of his stuff, his beast flies and his hollow flies, and heading down your way October to do some albie fishing. And so I've been obsessed with, surf candies and stuff like that recently. And so I've been burning the pages of that book, looking at all, reading every word to make sure I got it right. And so it's kind of fun, but yeah.
Yeah, very, very cool. And, your current day job is you're the owner of Relentless Fly Fishing, and you've talked a little bit about, guiding in Alaska, but, how did you go from kind of being a late fly fishing bloomer to getting the guide bug?
Honestly, it was, day one in Alaska. I graduated college having no idea what I was going to do with my life, and never really thought about, fishing being, a career path for me. My dad's a commercial fisherman, and so, fishing has kind of always been my life. He's also a retired tournament bass guy on, kind of local circuits. And so I never really thought about it. And I did a summer in Alaska in college. They had a program called Study America. And so you college credits to backpack the Inside Passage of Alaska. And I had some family up there, and my cousin, who actually teaches with my old boss, Paul, they're both teachers at a native high school in Sitka. And he was like, "Hey man, what do you think of Alaska?" I'm like, "This place is the most amazing place I've ever been. Like, I'd love to come back." And he's like, "Well, I could probably get you a job, counting fish at a weir. I've got some buddies that, are fishing guides." And I said, "Yeah, man, that'd be awesome." And that was the end of the conversation. And 3 weeks before I graduated, he said, "Hey, Paul's looking for a deckhand and a fly fishing guide. He's like, I know you fish a lot. Do you have any fly fishing experience?" And I said, "Well, I have some. I know how to tie knots and I can roughly cast." And so I moved to Alaska, and I got there, and Paul came up, and we introduced ourselves to each other, and he said, "All right, well, we're gonna go steelhead fishing for 3 days. You're in charge of cleaning the boat and getting it ready to go." And so, college graduate, coming out of college, you think when you graduate, like, you deserve everything. And I'm laying on my back underneath of a 27-foot, ocean going boat, scrubbing barnacles. And I'm like, I moved to Alaska to do this. What am I doing? And I looked over to my left, and there was a giant mountain right next to me. And I said, "Oh yeah, this is okay. I'll do this." And then my first day on the steelhead, we did a little bit of guiding for steelhead in the early season, and then, fly fishing for trout and salmon, and then deep sea stuff. And I remember walking up the river the first time with the fly rod, sight fishing for steelhead in these small creeks in Southeast Alaska, and just being like blown away by the intricacy of fly fishing. And that was it. It was the first day in Alaska that I was like, okay, this is something that I could definitely get into. And, moved back after 2 years up there, and was working at a hardware store that I worked at in high school and college. And I was like, this is terrible. I would go from, grizzly bears and orcas and, humpback whales to counting nuts and bolts in the hardware store. And so, blindly, I put a cover letter out to a few fly shops and guide services up down the East Coast, and TCO got back to me, and I went up and interviewed, and they said, yeah, we'd love to have you. And during the interview, they asked me, do you have any questions? And the only question I had was, do you guys have a guide service? Because I knew that guiding was what I really wanted to do. And they said, well, we kind of have this on-stream instruction, but it's not really guiding. But, so we do some guiding. And I said, well, and in my head, I'm like, well, I know what I'm going to do. And so while I was managing the fly shop in Redding, I basically started building a guide service. And we went from doing about 7 to 10 trips a year to, 100 and some. And then, Relentless we're on our 5th season right now. And, we're quadrupling that number right now. So it's been a pretty cool experience. So I would say that was an extremely long-winded answer for, I just kind of, as soon as I put a fly rod in my hand, knew that I wanted to teach people how to do this, and I loved it. And so that's kind of what drew me to be a guide, was just loving the atmosphere and the adventure and teaching people how to fish, and it just kind of fit. So it was one of those things that kind of got dumped into and then just ran with it.
Yeah, really neat. And, so you grew it, and you're, I guess, really, you're kind of like the contract guide service for TCO. What TCO fly shops do you guide for?
So Relentless manages the Haverford location, the Redding location, and the Boiling Springs location. So if you were to ever go out with, call any of those stores, we do all of the guiding for those stores. And originally it was just the Redding and the Boiling Springs location, because those are the 2 shops that I, managed at one point in my career at TCO. And then we kind of decided, I had some guys that worked at both stores, and, between like Redding and Haverford, or Boiling Springs and Redding. And so we kind of made sense that we would just put all 3 of them together, and it's been great. I mean, I've got an amazing crew of guys, I always, listening to Tony and Paul and those guys talk about, successful business. And I was a business major as well. And so, just going from the academic side to the real world side, and just seeing the success of these, few companies that I've worked for in the industry, they've always had an amazing team. Their team is what makes them successful. And I have 2 full-time guys, Neil Sunday and Brendan Roosh. Brendan mainly does smallmouth, and Neil is almost 100% trout, does some steelhead stuff as well. But those guys are like, they're my pinch hitters. Like, anytime I need them, they're there. I asked them 3 years ago if they'd have a little faith in me and kind of commit to working full time. And I needed a couple years to make, to get them to where they are now. But I needed their commitment to be full time, and they said, yeah, let's do it. And so, and then all of my part-time guys, either work in the shop or, do something in the outdoor world, and then guide, part-time / full-time. Some of them are doing, a good number of days, but, they all bring something different to the table. And I think that's what makes us, so successful, is we have just a well-rounded, group of guys. We've got, some guys that are biologists by trade. And so, they'll send me a picture of a bug, and I'm like, oh, it's a sulfur. And they'll be like, no, it's a blah, 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 blah. I'm like, I don't even know what that means. Neither does a trout. It's just yellow, and, but, so we've got some guys that are super deep into that. And then we've got guys that are, big steelhead guys. And, Brendan is by far, I think he might be a fish. He might be a smallmouth, I would say, because he just loves smallmouth. And, so they're in it, I'm in it, and it's been a great experience so far. So, although I did have 2 casualties this year, 2 of my guys broke their feet, which I don't even know how to, I can't even fathom what that would be like in the middle of the season to lose a month to 6 weeks because I broke my foot. But, so it's never a smooth experience, I guess.
Yeah. It's interesting too that you say that, because I think, it's, people are always asking me for guide recommendations. And I think, just like people have different personalities, guides have different personalities, and you're always trying to match the right guide with the right person.
For sure. Yeah. That is actually one of the biggest things that I have to deal with when somebody calls or emails, and I would say after, over a decade doing this, you can kind of read a person's personality now, even through email in a lot of ways. And then once you get them on the phone, you're like, okay, this guy needs to go with this guy, or this girl needs to go with, with this guide. And, it's definitely a balancing act for sure of figuring out who's going to have the best experience. And honestly, sometimes I give trips away that I could potentially do, but I know that now in my career and where I'm at, like, they're going to have a better experience with Neil, or they're going to have a better experience with one of my newer guys, because I just don't have the energy to teach as like I used to. And, I still like to teach a lot, but I'm not as good as some of these other guys is at teaching. So, I know that they're going to have a better experience with this guy than they would with me. So I happily slide that to somebody else. And that's something that I had to wrap my head around as well. Is, I want to do every trip that calls, but I don't have the time. And I know that that's one of the reasons why I have an awesome team, is because these guys will fit, with different groups. And one of the really cool things that's come out of COVID is we've had a lot of new anglers and a lot of families and husbands and wives, or, sons and moms that come out and do it. And so we've seen a huge flux or a huge increase in female anglers. And I think that's amazing. But some of my guys, like Neil, for instance, he was an Olympic snowboard coach, and he still coaches downhill snowboard racing. And so he's a really good teacher for kids and the younger generation. And, so when anytime we have somebody that calls it, got a younger kid, like Neil is definitely my top choice. Or, unless I've met them at a show or something and they request me, specifically, I try to slide them to Neil. But, I don't know where I was going with that. So we were talking about, personalities and stuff like that. So,
yeah, I mean, I think it all kind of, gets put together to kind of that secret for being a good guide, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that you definitely have to know your strengths and your weaknesses. And, that was a lesson I had to learn, especially being the owner and having 13 other guys that are working for me. Like, I can't be on the water every day anymore. That was hard for me to I'm still doing a terrible job at it, but I'm trying really hard. That's my 2021 goal, is to step back and be okay with it. And know that, it's not about, I did 200 trips this year. How many did you do? And it's about how many did the guide service do, and how many happy clients do we have? And I love being the boss. And now I don't like calling myself a boss because I have a team, but, being the point man and getting an email from a client that, Brendan took out, or Neil took out, or Eric took out, or Alex took out, and them saying we had a phenomenal time, and, please forward this email to that guide and tell them that, we'll be back because of how awesome they were. And for me, that's awesome. I love hearing that stuff. So.
Yeah, very neat. And, so you built this guide service, while you were at TCO, and, probably within the last 4 to 6 weeks, you released your first book, Smallmouth Bass Flies Top to Bottom. Not everybody that's in fly fishing writes a book. What made you want to do that?
Honestly, it's been I would say a dream of mine since the first time I walked into the fly shop in Alaska, and there was, some books there, and I was like, man, this is so cool to know something so well, and to have the information that you want to share. And I was actually, if you were to ask any one of my English professors from middle school through college, if you told them that I wrote a book, they'd probably slap you in the face and tell you that you're lying, because I was terrible at writing in the English language. But so I was always afraid of that, but I always knew that I wanted to write a book. It was something that, it was more or less like, what am I going to write it on? And, I remember I bought, I might botch this, but I think it was Chico Fernandez's Bonefish book, when I was in Alaska, which is, of all places, which was kind of funny. And I read that book cover to cover, because I was obsessed with bonefish, and just the knowledge and the information you get out of it from a book. It's why would you not want to share what you've put, dedicated your life to for the past, 14 years? Why would you not want to try to cut a lot of that learning curve off for people and share that information. And, the book was something that could reach people from all around the world, and, not a lot of people can, I would say, let me back up. You can't get that reach of people just by doing a presentation at a local TU chapter at a fly show. And so to be able to kind of go at a worldwide, kind of education, I thought that was something that would be really cool. And the book process was tough. I mean, when I was writing, I was not like sure I was ever going to finish it. There were times where I was like, oh my God, what did I get myself into? And then you get really close to the end and your mentality changes. If you would have asked me, 6 months into writing a book, if I would ever write another one, I would have told you you're crazy. No, but when I published it and I got the first copy, in the mail, I was like, I'd write another one. Now that I know how to do it, I would write another one. But, so yeah, I guess it would be, an industry dream that I've had since the day I stepped into the industry, and it's kind of cool to have done it. So
yeah, it's really neat too. And looking at the book, and I'm, obviously talking to you, you've got a ton of smallmouth knowledge, and you share not just, fly information in the book, but that's really the chassis that you kind of built all of this around, and kind of the way I guess you want to share, your smallmouth knowledge. And, for folks that haven't had a chance to take a look at the book, it's basically broken into surface, mid-column, and bottom flies. And I was really kind of curious, how you came up with kind of the fly-oriented approach to structure your book.
I think the biggest reason why we went with that direction was because I had a lot of flies, and as much as I didn't want to be known as a fly tyer, I wanted to be known more as a guide and that stuff. I realized that fly tying, in a lot of ways, or I shouldn't say fly tying, but flies in general, in a lot of ways, are the basis of fly fishing. And so, you can educate people not only on a fly, but how to fish it, why to fish it, when to fish it, and where to fish it. And when you break it down that way, one of the reasons why we want to do that is because smallmouth bass are very similar to trout, to big water trout. Where they hold, what they eat, how they eat, when they eat. And so I really wanted to kind of try to bridge the gap between trout fishing and smallmouth fishing. And so I kind of broke it down into the three main feeding columns for any fish, really, not just trout, but and kind of show that they're a freshwater predator, just like a trout. And so I wanted to break it down that way. And, I also, didn't want, to write a step-by-step how to fish book. There's a lot of, when we were kind of deciding what we were going to write, how we were going to write it, it was like, there's a kind of three different types of books. There's like the fly encyclopedia book where it's just patterns and talking about different flies. And then there's the, tutorial book. And then there's the tips, tactics, and strategies book. And so I kind of wanted to try to put all three of them together and give you an encyclopedia of smallmouth bass, not just fly patterns, but, the tying stuff, the new materials, and kind of put it all together and make it a bench book and make it something that you can sit on your fly tying bench and, look at it when you're tying a fly. And even if you're not tying one of the flies in the book, there's a lot of techniques in there that go to plenty of different flies. And so that was another thing I wanted to really talk about in the book was different techniques, not necessarily the fly pattern, but even like Blaine's Game Changer, just talking about the different ways you can tie it, the different sizes you can tie it, and, different types of flies that you can tie on that, on that platform. And I tell a lot of people, that Blaine didn't just create the Game Changer. Blaine created a platform for an articulated fly that wiggles and moves like nothing that's ever been designed before. So, if you look at the Game Changer platform itself, that can translate into a lot of other flies besides bait fish and stuff like that. So there was a lot of different stuff that went into that. And, quite frankly, reading it now and looking back, there's more and more stuff that I've learned in the past, 2 years that I didn't get to put in that book that I'm like, man, there's some stuff that I missed. There's some stuff that I wish I would have elaborated a little bit more on. But, who knows? Maybe there's another bass book in the future. I don't know.
Yeah, there you go. And it's interesting too, because each section has, I don't know, probably 6 or 7 patterns. And it was interesting, I thought, I noticed, some of them are your patterns. A lot of them aren't. And I was curious how you picked the half a dozen or so, top water flies, mid column flies, and bottom flies.
Honestly, I looked in my fly box and I was like, what are the flies that I use the most? And then I have a shoebox of flies that have been, taken out of the box from, 12 years ago when I started smallmouth fishing on the Schuylkill River. And, the flies that we used there were a little bit different than what we used on the Juniata and a little bit different than the stuff we used in Michigan. So, bass are bass, but, I think I've heard Mike say this many times is like, bass are bass, but each system fishes differently. And so there's a different approach to each system. And so I was digging through this shoebox full of flies that I would call my reject flies and, pulled some stuff out there. I was like, oh my gosh, I totally forgot about how great this fly was. Like, that's got to go in there. I haven't tied it in 5 years, but this one's got to go in there. So, and then, just some other iconic stuff that I, wanted to elaborate on, like, obviously Blaine's book came out, The Game Changer and book. And so it's kind of hard to put one in there, but I had my own spin on one of the changer patterns or platforms and wanted to share that. And, I've got some buddies that are huge, trout streamer guys. And they do a lot of bass too. And, my one buddy Austin was going to the White River and he pulled out his fly box the White River and he was like, dude, check this out. And I was like, oh my God, that's an amazing spring bass fly. Oh my God, that'd be a perfect like wintertime fly. And I said, can I have one of those? And he said, yeah, sure. And so, one of them, which is the crafty bait fish, was one that he tied to the White River for trout. And I was like, this is a perfect example of a trout fly that will go into a bass, that will go into the warm water world as well. And so I did a few tweaks to it and, made it a little bit more bassy by adding a rattle and making the head a little bulkier and, just a couple other minuscule things under the hood. And I said, Austin, check this out. And he was like, how did you make my pattern better? And I was like, I don't know. I just thought about it the way I would want a bass to eat it or bass to see it. And then I asked him, I said, can I do a tutorial of this one? Cause I think it's a perfect trout streamer that will, go over into a bass. And he was like, yeah, absolutely. So, a lot of it was influenced from some of my buddies that were trout guys too. And so, when you take all that together and then, I wrote an article for Fly Fisherman Magazine, which was pretty awesome too. Have read Fly Fisherman Magazine for the past 15 years or so, probably longer than that. To be able to write for that magazine was pretty awesome. But I wrote an article on trout tactics for smallmouth, and it kind of took some stuff out of the top water pieces of my book and put it into a magazine article and talked about how low water smallmouth are very similar to spring creek trout or western trout, thinking about the Missouri River and, stuff like that. And so that's where some of the like parachute chubby Chernobyl or parachute, can't even think about what it's called now, parachute Chernobyl hopper, got into the book because it was one of my favorite grasshopper patterns to use for western trout. And then when we had started to see bass spooking off of frogs and bigger poppers, I started bringing out some grasshoppers and stuff. And that became one of my best low water summer bugs. And so, when you kind of move around in that side of the world, you kind of want to show everybody the different stuff. So I would say, flies that have been tried and true, not only in bass, but also in trout, and then tested on bass and they work. So, and then talking about, we talked about the other day when we talked on the phone, about the book that the guys from Wisconsin did. And, they talk a lot about the Mr. Wiggly, and, the foam game out there and the confidence eats. And, I remember reading some of that stuff, and actually I think Brennan was the first one that showed me the old Mr. Wiggly fly. And I was like, wow, that's awesome. And I said, that's the key that we needed for summertime. And so, taking some influence from those guys who've been, guiding longer than I've been, here on this planet in some way. So, taking a lot of stuff that you've learned from other people too, and kind of showcasing that's the best way to do it.
Yeah, I think one of the neat things too, and we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording tonight, is, the patterns are not just kind of, the most modern, most current, but, it's clear that you have a lot of respect for kind of, what I think of as the entire progression. I mean, you've got, kind of classic Chuck Craft patterns that people think about, and you've got some of the kind of, early, Michigan articulated fly designs, and then some of the current stuff too. So I thought it was really interesting how your fly selection really kind of covered the history of smallmouth flies.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, well, I say unfortunately, Chuck Craft, passed away, but I remember talking to him, at some of the shows and down at Mossy Creek a few times, and just looking at his flies and being like, wow, like, they're simple, but man, do they work, and you think about, the term guide fly, and you think about, just how you wanted that fly to work. And when you take the simple flies, like even the clouded minnow, I mean, Bob came up with one of the greatest flies that will ever be created, not only for smallmouth, but for trout and for saltwater. And you can never forget about where the bass world started. No matter how new you are, how old you are into it, you always got to remember that, these guys are the guys that were doing it way before I picked up a fly rod. And so the stuff that worked for them, will always be a staple in the bass world. And so I think it's really important to, always, remember the guys that came first and the guys that, kind of blazed the path first. And I think I get a lot of that from the commercial fishing world, because like, you always had to, my dad, when I was a kid, he was in his 30s and 20s, and, he is very respectful of the commercial guys that were in their 50s and 60s. And so like kind of seeing that at a very young age of like, oh, you always have to respect the guys that have been doing it longer and the guys that are still to this day, cutting the edge of fly design and even just reimagining stuff or like tweaking the flies that were amazing back then so that they'll then work a little bit more. Because I think one of the biggest things with fly design today is that like the fishing pressure is way more. And so, those bass can get, not just bass, but any fish gets very, very, familiar with certain things and the way that they move. And I think that, modern fly design is trying to break that puzzle of how do you get those fish to eat the way they did 20 years ago, with 20, 30, 40 times more pressure. And I think that's one of the big things with fly design today. And just thinking about those guys back then, their flies still work today, which means that like, they figured it out and they figured it out long term. So I think it's important, to show that stuff and all the guys. I mean, Ellie Rhodes, down in Virginia, he sent me some amazing flies. Obviously he was right there with Chuck Craft and I love seeing some of that, his influence in those guys as well. And just the confidence that they have in those patterns. And I think that was a big deciding factor for me, was just how much confidence do other guys have in these flies and how much confidence they have in their flies. And it wasn't just the bass book for Pennsylvania. It was the bass book for, everywhere there's smallmouth. So.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because, kind of talking about that, it's really interesting to see those kind of fly, design and material selection really, for people that are really serious about tying, and particularly, none of us get to fish as much as we want to, some of the things you share, in terms of, we were talking before we started recording, like, how to manage flash and veiling a game changer, little things like that, I think are, really kind of, for everything else, make the book a super worthwhile purchase for folks that want to figure that out. What made you so comfortable to share some of that secret sauce with all of us?
It's funny. I remember my dad being a commercial fisherman. He's always like, he's like, don't tell anybody anything, because next thing you know, you're going to have 10 guys in your spot. And I remember telling my dad the first time that I was writing a book, and I thought he'd be like super proud of me, which he is. But he was like, didn't I teach you anything? You're going to give away all your secrets. And I said, well, part of the fun of being a guide and being a, if you would call it a quote unquote professional in the industry, is that, you learn the hard way. And if I can share some of that information, I'm going to share that information with other people. and most of the people aren't going to fish as much as I am, and they're not, so for that information to get into the hands of people that, don't have the ability to experiment as much as I do, I think that's my part of, giving back to the industry and like making my time on the water, whether it's a rock star day or it's one of those days where it leaves you scratching your head, like what did I just do? I mean, I remember last year water got so low that there was a couple of times where I was like, I just wrote a book on smallmouth and I can't figure them out. Like, what is going on? And then you have to take a step back and you think about, okay, well, this is what the conditions are, and this is how I would think about it. And so for me, I just thought it was giving back. And another thing that I think is important too is that flies, no matter how well or bad they're tied or how many times they're fished, like every angler fishes a fly differently. So like, I am happy to tell you how I fish them. I'm happy to tell you how I tie them, but the way that I fish them versus the way Brennan fishes them, or, Bill Bob, who's coming down in a kayak, fishes them, they're all going to be fished different. And so, I think one of the biggest things for me is that, like, I know that there's minuscule differences in the way that I'll fish versus the way another guy will fish. And so I'm not really that scared about it. And I also think that the information that I've learned, I want to share. I had somebody once tell me, like, isn't the fun of, fly fishing, being able to figure it out yourself? And, my response to that is like, yeah, but another part is being able to share all that information with people that don't do it as much. And I think that's important. So I don't know. I think I just wanted to share people. I wanted to make it easier for people. My main focus on this book was to get people jazzed on smallmouth, because it's a rapid growing part of our sport. And, I think that if I can get people excited about it, whether they hire me as a guide or one of my other guides, or just get out and fish and get excited about smallmouth, that's what I really care about. So, I guess that might be the main reason why I did it, was because I want people to get excited about that.
Yeah, it's interesting too. And, in addition to, I don't know, probably the 20 or so main patterns in the book, I mean, you literally, have hundreds of patterns from all over the world. I mean, not just people, that we know about, like Chuck or Ellie Rhodes or Schultze or Blaine, but I mean, I think I saw some patterns from Europe. And, tell us a little bit about what the process was like, soliciting and collecting all those patterns and organizing them for the book.
Yeah, I mean, some of it, fell on deaf ears, and, I just kind of reached out, I mean, I will say, social media, depending on who you talk to, some people say social media ruined the sport. Some people say it's, a black hole of ideas. And, some people say that people just fish now to become Insta famous. But I think that, what Instagram did was it opened up a lot of avenues of just getting to know people. So I'll be honest, like, I found emails for some people, and obviously got information from other people that I knew, and was like, hey, do you know this person? Do you have their contact info? Can I get their stuff? I want to get some flies. But also some of it was, I just drafted up basically an email, a very short and, to the point email. And I sent it to like 20 different tires via Instagram, and, probably 15 of them got back to me and said yes. And then, some of them never sent flies. And after the 6th or 7th time, I asked them for them, and they said, yeah, they're coming. I, got to the point where I just didn't have time anymore, and they didn't make it. But, some of the guys were awesome, and they just were like, yep, what's your address? And a week later I had, 4 patterns or 5 patterns, and it was great. So, a lot of guys were super stoked to see it. And I also thought it was really cool because, to see the number of people. I mean, I've got bass flies from Colorado and Montana, and California and, Texas, and I think out Texas, and then the main, states like Michigan and New York and Virginia and Maine and PA. But it was really cool to get some guys that were trouty guys, in Colorado that tied, certain crayfish patterns that trout eat. And I was like, hey, can I have some of those from a book? Because those are amazing crayfish patterns. And they're like, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Instagram was a huge part of that. And then just kind of going through the people at the industry and that were bass guys or trout guys that had good flies. And I just kind of reached out and said, hey, can I have some flies? And I now have a bag of flies from around the world, which some of them I have fished. Some of them are so nice that I refuse to fish. Some of them I just have as, kind of as, patterns to have and talk about. So, but some of it was just like, I went through the kind of gamut of like, what are the classics? What are the originals? And then what are the, more modern ones? What are some of the more off the wall ones? They're like, man, that guy in Spain spins some amazing deer hair bugs. Like, yeah, they might be very similar to Pat Cohen's, who I've got a bunch of his flies, or, a couple of the guys that I've got from out west or, Midwest, but like, man, like he's just got a different spin on them, and I really like the style. And so, you shoot them an email and say, hey, like, can you send me some stuff? And, they're all about it. So I know that we've sent, the fly shop did most of the book sales for me, as well as, other shops bought books too, but TCO's, sold like well over 300 copies at this point. And I know they've sent them to, Australia, England, I think there might have been one to South Africa or something like that. So some people are buying them, around the world, which is really cool. And I think that having influence from all over the country and the world, just added to that kind of camaraderie of fly fishing. So it's not the U.S. versus the rest of the world. It's the whole world as a whole in this industry is, pushing the edge. So.
Yeah, it's really neat. And, you mentioned that, you're ready to write another book, but the writing and editing process was a bit of a grind at some point. What was the process like? And, what was kind of the biggest challenge or surprise that popped out?
I think the biggest challenge was just time. I mean, you don't realize that writing a book is not just writing words on a piece of paper. It's, it's gathering the flies. It's, kind of contacting different tires. It's, you ask them to send a recipe in a specific, kind of order, and it comes completely backwards. And so, instead of sitting down for your 2 hours allotted a day that you're going to write, you're going to, have all these ideas. You've got to sit there and rewrite all the recipes. And, and then when you take the photos, you have to, number the photos, and then you have to remember which photo goes to which pattern. And so, there was a lot of back and forth and organization that I thought was the hardest part. And it was coming at all different speeds. And so, I'd say the biggest challenge for me was just like putting it all together and realizing once you start writing that the writing itself is the easiest part of the book process. And so, getting the photos and making sure, everything is, the right resolution and, all of the little stuff. I mean, honestly, I finished the book and then it was a 3-month back and forth to Stackpole on, what about, is this the right way that this is supposed to be spelled? Is this the right, term for this? Do you want all of these to be this way, written this way or this way, or, and so, the details that go into writing a book and getting it published is just daunting, in my opinion. But, once you do it once, okay, now I know that like I have to write and then I have to manage all the photos and manage all the captions and, and make sure it all comes back full circle and it's not just a bunch of ideas on a piece of paper. I think that was the biggest challenge, but honestly, it was a lot of fun. One of the things that I thought was really fun was actually, getting to do a couple photo shoots. So it was kind of like, you're photo shooting, but you're really just fishing with your buddies and taking a really high quality camera along and trying to get the right shots and the right angles. And so it was a process for sure, but it was definitely fun. But I would say the writing part, realizing that the writing was the easiest part, was probably the most daunting thing to kind of overcome.
Yeah, interesting, because you kind of think you're done and then you're not.
Yeah, and then you're like, oh shoot, I forgot all of the hook sizes for those 25 flies, and you got to go back through and get the right. The other thing that was interesting too was you had to have the right size of hook, the right name of the hook, and the right brand of the hook. And sometimes you would get a fly and you'd be like, oh, it's just a size 6 streamer hook. Well, what kind of streamer hook is that? So then I have to go through and like look at I'm like, I'm working in the fly shop and being a tire. I have a pretty good eye for most hook brands. And so like I'd get a hook and I'm like, that's probably a Mustad. It's on a saltwater hook and it's, a little bit, it's not as shiny. Mustad's known for their kind of more like matte finish. And so you go to Mustad and you like look at the fly, you look at the hook, you look at the fly, and then some of it was just a guess of like, yeah, that looks pretty close to what I think it is, and then you just kind of go with it. But so knowing all of the materials, I mean, when I was writing, I would say that 70% of the time I was writing, I had a hairline and a Wapsi catalog sitting next to me to make sure I got the right color name and all that stuff right. So, but it was fun. It was definitely a challenge for me. But once it all started to come together, then my kind of OCD organizational mind just got really excited, and I just kind of rolled with it.
Yeah, very neat. Is there anything else on the horizon you want to share with our listeners?
Well, we kind of talked a little bit about my love for the saltwater and the Chesapeake, and hopefully maybe in the future there will be a little bit of saltwater influence back in my life, as well as Relentless. And so we might, one of the big things that I'm hoping will happen if everything, if all the stars align, is that maybe as long as it doesn't drag me too thin, is kind of getting back into a little bit of my home waters on the Chesapeake and, kind of maybe guiding down there a bit. But, the other big thing that's hopefully going to happen is show season this year, if it actually works, with COVID and stuff. But I'll be at the International Fly Tying Symposium this year, and I'm pretty excited and also kind of blessed to be, a quote unquote celebrity there. So I'll be doing a tying demo and a presentation, and then at all the other shows I'll be doing some demos, and I'll be at the author's booth and stuff. And so, show season will be my big thing. I'm trying to plan a book tour right now, but there's a lot of maybes, ifs, ands, and buts with everything. A lot of shops still aren't doing the in-person stuff, and so what's kind of trying to figure that, kind of navigate through that situation, and then if that doesn't work, what I'll probably end up doing again this winter is doing some Zoom classes and presentations and stuff like that. And we did some last year, which were very successful. And I think the Zoom stuff's not going anywhere because it can reach so much further, and, people want to learn how to tie certain flies, but, they might be in Michigan and they might be in New York, and they're not going to drive to Boiling Springs, Pennsylvania.
Yeah. And, before I let you hop, you want to let folks know kind of the best place to buy your book. And kind of how to follow, your adventures and Relentless Fly Fishing's adventures online.
Yeah, sure. So obviously you can get the book on Amazon. A lot of people have Prime, so that makes it pretty easy. But, your local fly shop has it. I know Schultz has it. Tightlines has it. Mad River has it. TCO obviously has it. But most of my book sales go through TCO. So if you really need to get them, they've got them in stock. And so that would be the easiest way to get them. Hopefully, if my books show up, I just ordered a few more cases because I sold out. They'll be on my website as well. And my website is relentlessflyfishing.com. That's got all the information for, our guide service. It's got some links to some YouTube videos, and I've got a blog that I kind of keep up on. I'm not doing a great job at it right now, but you can click on the link to subscribe to our mailing list, and we do right now quarterly newsletters, and hopefully next year we'll do monthly newsletters with kind of things that are going on and whatnot. And then you can follow me on Instagram, Relentless Fly Fishing, or Facebook. It's Jake Villwock or Relentless Fly Fishing. Got a page for that as well. And I think that's about all I got right now. Oh, I do have a YouTube channel, Relentless TV. It's got some time videos and some other stuff like that. I'm kind of trying to revamp that a little bit. I've been out of that game for a bit. So depending on how cold the winter is, that's when you'll see more videos come up, probably this winter. So,
well, there you go. And I imagine too that if folks buy the book through your website, it's probably the best way to get a personalized copy back, right?
Yeah. So right now, if you buy them through any of the fly shops, TCO specifically, it's just a book. If you want it signed, you just put it in the comments, and I'll drive to the shop and sign it. So it might be an extra day or two before it ships. But once I get them up on my site, after I get some more back in stock, if you put a put a note in the comments on if you want to personalize to a specific person or something you want to say. We can sign all that stuff as well. So.
Well, very neat. Well, listen, Jake, I appreciate you spending some time with me this evening after what I'm sure was a pretty long day on the water.
Yeah, no worries. Early morning tomorrow, and I'm excited about it.
Well, there you go. Well, listen, Jake, thanks again so much.
You got it. Take care.
Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed that as much as we enjoyed bringing it to you. Again, if you like the podcast, please tell a friend, and please subscribe and leave us a rating and review in the podcatcher of your choice. Tight lines, everybody.